I'm recording my homily for the 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time, which means next Sunday is the feast day of Christ the King. As the liturgy says, King of the universe. So not just King of Earth or just King of our solar system, but King of the universe, right? So it's pretty amazing. I'll obviously be talking about that next week, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. So this week, though, kind of ties in with some of the themes that are going to come up over the next couple weeks, which is where we look at what Jesus' vision is of the end of the world, the end times, but also just the smaller things that happen that are pretty significant in our lives and how Jesus wants us to engage them, okay? So the gospel this weekend, Jesus is kind of talking about the end of the world. He's talking about a time when people are going to come, they're going to arrest you, they're going to put you on trial, some are even going to be executed, and the temple is going to be torn down, and there's going to be earthquakes and famines and plagues, and it sounds like all of end of the world stuff. But then it's easy to dismiss it as well and say, well, it's the end of the world, we don't know when that's going to happen, so I'll just forget about it, right? But let's go through it a little bit. Now, before I go to that, a while back there was a movie called Gettysburg. And it wasn't like a blockbuster movie or anything like that. But it's definitely well worth watching if you like historical dramas. Okay? So obviously the movie's about the Civil War. Now, Gettysburg is a town in Maryland. Very small, still a small town. But it was a very small town in Maryland. And there was a group of cavalry soldiers. So cavalry, they're on horseback, right? So there's a small group of cavalry soldiers from the Union, from the North, that was kind of passing through Gettysburg. And the general who was in charge knew, as he looked across the landscape, right? And it's just fields and fields, right? And hills with trees and just wide open spaces. He knew what was coming because the South, the troops from the South were coming up north, and they were doing really good. They were winning a lot of battles, and their intent was the South wanted to circle around through Maryland, come back in, and take over Washington, D.C. Now, if that were to have happened in the Civil War, the United States of America right now probably would not exist. And so Gettysburg becomes this battle that didn't decide the whole war, but it was like the hinge. It was the hinge where the North began to change the outcome of the entire war. And one could argue change the outcome of the entire country. Now, let's go back to the battle, though. Let's go back to Gettysburg. So you have this one general. He's surveying the landscape. No other soldiers are there yet. But there's this moment in the movie where he's looking out and he says, I can see it as though it had already happened. I can see our soldiers taking too long to get here. I can see the South coming in and entrenching in the hills. I can see the war beginning and blood just being spilled all over. I can see the North being slaughtered. Now, this was a general who was battle-hardened. He knew what war was like, and he knew what was necessary in order to win a war, especially the way they fought it back then. But he also knew something else. His boss, the general in charge of the entire North Army, was a very cautious man. And so if he sent word back to him asking for his advice or asking for his approval to engage the enemy or to set up, their forces there, he knows that the general, because he's a very cautious man, would tell him to wait. He says, just wait, right? And if they had waited, they would have lost. It would have been a bloodbath. So, he doesn't wait. He wasn't disobedient, but he just took the initiative. And as soon as the Southern soldiers started coming into the battlefield, he immediately engaged them and pushed them back And even though at that moment it was just a small group of guys, he immediately pushed them back, and then more soldiers started coming in and more soldiers started coming in on both sides. But the North was able to maintain control. Now, what's so impressive to me was that the outcome of that entire battle was because that one general in the moment was able to use his wisdom. He was able to see what was about to happen, and he acted. He didn't wait. He didn't wait for all hell for the whole world to go to hell, right? And so we look at our world, and we can lament the bad things we see and how much our world has changed in the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years. You wonder if we had had a general like him, if we could have stopped some of the change, some of the bad stuff that's happened in our world. But I want to tie it back to Jesus. So Jesus in the gospel today, how does this whole story begin? He's outside the temple area in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, the temple in its heyday was a beautiful building. It was like going to St. Peter's Basilica, right? So you can imagine yourself outside St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and you're just admiring it. You're taking pictures. You're just kind of in awe of the whole thing. And because you're Catholic, you feel this spiritual strength. And so Jesus and all the Jewish people would feel that in Jerusalem when they were by the temple. And so there's people there who are admiring the costly stones and the votive offerings and everything that's happening, and they're just so impressed by it and feel strengthened by it. And Jesus walks up to them and says, "It's all coming down. It's all going to be destroyed." Can you imagine how you'd feel if you were outside St. Peter's Basilica and somebody walks up to you and says, "You know what? It's all going to be destroyed." Say, that guy's a party pooper, right? But wisdom, the ability to see what's happening, to see what needs to be done, and then to act, right? So Jesus is the one, if you will. He's kind of like this general who comes in. He sees he knows what's going to happen if he doesn't act. And so that's when he calls the disciples, he calls the apostles, and he begins to train them. He begins to prepare them for battle, spiritual battle. That's what's meant to happen in each of our lives, to prepare us for spiritual battle, so that we're not just caught off guard. We don't just watch our families get broken to pieces and spiritually die or languish or whatever, okay? Now, what does he say is going to happen? If he can see the future, just like that general could see the future, if he didn't act, what does Jesus say is going to happen? He says, people are going to get put on trial. They're going to get led before synagogues and government officials. And some are even going to get put to death. Now, did any of that happen to him? Yes, right? Are we surprised when that happens to us? In the coming years after the time of Jesus, was the temple ever destroyed? He says it's going to be destroyed. Yes. 40 years after his death, that temple is torn down by the Roman army. They come in and just sack Jerusalem, and not one stone is left upon another. In the coming years, did people have to run for their lives? One place in the gospel, it says that family members will turn each other in. Fathers will betray sons, and all the different family, they're going to betray each other. Has that happened? When the faith was illegal, yes. I was preaching to our Hispanic community this week, and I was talking to them about the time after the Mexican Revolution when it was made illegal to be Catholic, and just the things that happened during that time. And I was talking about Saint Joselito, who was a 14-year-old boy. He's now a saint, but he was a 14-year-old boy who was martyred in the midst of that persecution of the Catholics. And there was all kinds of betrayals that were happening because people were living out of fear, right? I think it's important for us to say, when we read these things and we think about these things, what is it that Jesus wants us to be able to do or to foresee and then act on now and not wait? There's a couple things that he outlines in the gospel today for his disciples. The first thing he says is, there's going to be people who are going to come in his name, and they're going to say that they are him, or that they have these answers, and he says, don't follow them. They're going to say when the end of the world is, or things like that. He says, no, don't follow them. He says, don't be deceived. How many messages we get on a daily basis, if you read the news, if you use the internet, teenagers in school, how many different messages they have coming at them, and then if they watch cable TV and satellite and all these things, beloved train, and all these things, it's going to honk one more time. All these things happen. I lost my train of thought. So they have so many messages coming at them that they have to use wisdom. We have to prepare our kids for these types of things. I think that's why our confirmation classes are so important right now. Especially, the age limit is dropped a little bit, so it's a little bit younger. But to really prepare these kids, because they're going to get so bombarded. Not all the messages are bad, but a lot of them are harmful. So they need to be equipped so that they can act, not so that they can just run in fear, but they can act. They can defend themselves, they can defend their friends, they can protect themselves, they can use truth, right? They can use love. So not to be deceived. Let's be mindful, let's be watchful, let's evaluate what we're hearing and really think about it. This is one of the importance of studying philosophy, even though I didn't do very good in philosophy in the seminary. And I don't necessarily like studying philosophy, but there are some basic principles of philosophy to say, is this true, what I'm hearing? And if it is, why? And if it's not, why not? Right? And then how do I bring truth into it if it's a lie, if there's deception? All right, so don't be deceived. Don't be deceived. You think of all the political stuff going on in our world and how we're so adversarial in our political, let's say, what is truth? Don't just line yourself with one particular group, but say, what is the truth? Okay. The other thing, it's in the second reading. St. Paul says, I think he's talking to the Thessalonians, right? So in Thessalonica, one of the problems that they were having was there was some people who they weren't doing anything. They were just minding everybody else's business. And so he kind of chastises them for it. And he says, don't be minding everybody else's business, but work quietly. Do your work, okay? So spiritually speaking, moms and dads, do your work. Do your spiritual work that you're supposed to do. Raise your kids so they can be wise. They can be able to navigate our crazy world. As pastors, we need to work, right? I think one of the things I lament is that when we as priests get together and we talk, we're often a bunch of gossips. We sit around and we talk about church politics. We don't talk about anything inspirational. And I'm pointing my finger first at myself on that. So that's unfortunate, but it's like we're doing what St. Paul said. It's almost like we're demoralized. Our morale's kind of low, and so we just become a bunch of gossips. That's unfortunate, because that's a sign of spiritual illness. Okay? And so St. Paul says, no, work quietly. Working quietly doesn't mean being quiet. It means let's work. Let's do the work of Jesus Christ. Right? Now, one of the most powerful ways to do that, as Jesus will say in the gospel today, he says there's going to come a time where you're going to need to give testimony. He says, don't worry about what you're to say. The Holy Spirit will give you the words. As long as you stay close to God, as long as you're doing your holy hour every day, you're praying, you're staying close to God, living the state of grace, all those things, the Holy Spirit will give you the words. That's not the issue. He says, give testimony. When it comes time, don't be afraid to give testimony. What does that mean? If somebody came up to you and says, you need to give testimony. Look at the lights coming. Morning. It's a cold morning. Somebody says you need to give testimony. You're like, oh man, I got to go to court. I got to give testimony. So who gives testimony at court? Somebody who is a witness to something, right? So there was some event, something happened, and you heard something, or you saw something, and you now have to go to the court and give testimony to what you witnessed. Maybe you were part of it. Maybe you experienced it, right? There was a car accident. There was just something happened. And you have something that you need to bring to bear witness, to the truth of what happened. And so testimony is very important. If you want your neighbor to become Catholic, if you want your neighbor to become a believer, and he's out mowing his lawn, you can't just throw a catechism at him, right? There has to be a bearing of witness to the truth that's in the catechism. Catechism's awesome, important. But your neighbor is going to want the catechism only after he's seen testimony, or heard testimony, or saw testimony to the truths of what God is doing in our world. And so when our faith is transformative, people notice that. Then they want it. Then they want to read about it and learn about it, right? And so to give testimony, my dad was a permanent deacon. He passed away many years ago, but he was a permanent deacon, which meant he was able to give the homily at Mass. And we were in a very big parish where we grew up in El Paso, Texas. And we had, I think it was like 4 priests. We had 7 deacons. So it was a very large parish. And my dad didn't preach that often. But when I was a kid, and I was a dumb kid, so I go to Mass, and if the homily was not geared to me or was somehow bearing on my life in some manner, it was boring. And I have to say, sorry Lord, by and large the homilies that I heard growing up were boring. Now, to my parents, they weren't. There was some really good homilists, but to me as a kid, I often couldn't connect with them. When my dad would preach, I don't remember necessarily lots of the themes or the things he said specifically, because this is a long time ago. But I remember feelings. Now, he was my dad, so obviously there's feelings there. But I remember being inspired. I remember that. And don't get me wrong, there were other priests too that gave homilies. Were there times I felt inspired? But by and large, when my dad, when he would preach, I felt inspired. I think that's what giving testimony means. To bear witness. It means to inspire other people, to move their hearts, and thus moves their minds, right? They feel moved. They're like their world is shaken in some manner to change, to become someone better. Last night we had our confirmation class, and one of the kids in this little small group that I was leading at the last night, and he was relating how he has a teacher last year who just changed his life, just his whole outlook on life. And you could tell as he taught how he was just so full of light, just the way he described it. She just changed his life. He was inspired, right? That teacher bore testimony, was a witness to something, and demonstrated it in his life. If somebody comes up to you and they say, so for example, in my own parish, let's say they say, so are you Catholic? You say, yeah, I'm Catholic. Oh, he's like, oh, where do you go to church? I go to St. Mary's here in Marysville. Oh, really? Why? Why do you go to St. Mary's? Now, there's a lot of answers a person can give. It's convenient. I live close to the church. That's not bearing testimony, right? There's no witness value to that. A person could say, oh, I love the music. All right. Still not bearing testimony on anything or witness to anything really moving that moves the heart. Say, oh, those homilies are so awesome, right? Okay, I'm being arrogant here, right? You say, yeah, but that still doesn't move necessarily. Maybe it just makes you feel good. But if a person comes up to you and says, I go to St. Mary's because every Sunday morning I get to be with my brothers and sisters and I get to worship the living God with them. And then it doesn't necessarily matter if the music's good or not good, or the homily was good or not good. But I get to be with them and worship God with them every Sunday here in Marysville or wherever you live. And a person hearing that is going to hear you bearing witness. What has moved your heart? What you are in love with. And it's not something just earthly or transitory, but it's eternal. And people want to be part of that. And so when Jesus says, go out in the world and bear testimony, bear witness to the gospel, that's moving, right? That's deep, it's profound, it's lasting. It's things like that when you have that general who's out in that battlefield and nothing's happened yet, but he knows what's coming, then he's able to bear witness from his own experience, from his own knowledge, unto the whole world. And one could argue in that moment, he changed the outcome of not just that battle, but of the future of the United States. As you think of yourself, someone who knows how to bear testimony of how God is moving in their life, they're not going to just change one person. They're going to impact thousands of people through the course of their life. Sounds awesome, right? Okay, all right. So we're going to be finishing up this liturgical year next week with the Feast Day of Christ the King, and then entering into the season of Advent. All right. God bless you all. Have a great day.